Today we are going to look at what vocabulary you would need to know when working with square roots and cube root. The square root and cube root symbol is called the radical. The radical symbol for cube root is denoted by a 3 called the index. Now for the square root, the index of 2 is understood, so we do not have to write it. The number under the radical is called the radicand. Squaring a number, raising a number to the second power, means that you're multiplying that number by itself. So for example, we have 5 to the second power, which would be 5 times 5. The square root, it says one of the two like factors of a number. For example, the square root of 36 is equal to 6. So that factor would be 6. 6 times 6 will give you 36. Perfect square is a number that has a whole number as its square root. Cubing a number means that you're raising a number to the third power, multiplying the number by itself 3 times. For example, 2 to the third power is equal to 8. 2 times 2 times 2. The cube root says that one of the 3 like factors of a number, there must be a 3 on the outside of the radical. This denotes this operation. So remember, I mentioned before, you would not see the 2 written there, but for the cube root, you are going to see the index of 3. For example, the cube root of 125 is equal to 5. A perfect cube is a number that has an integer as its cube root. The principal square root, since every positive number has exactly 2 square roots, you would have the radical symbol without the negative. That's going to represent the non-negative, or the principal square root, and then you're going to have the symbol with the negative next to the radical. And if you notice, this negative is outside of my radical. This is represented by the negative square root. Now we are going to learn the first 25 perfect squares. So you would have to memorize the first 25 perfect squares. So let's go ahead and remember, perfect squares is you multiplying the number by itself raised to the second power. So 1 times 1, that gives us 1. 2 times 2, 4. 3 times 3, 9. 4 times 4, and so forth. So what I want you to do is fill in all of these perfect squares on that sheet. So 5 times 5, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, 196, 225, 256, 289, 324, 361, 400, 441, 484, 529, 576, and 625. Those are your first 25 perfect squares that you would have to learn. Okay, how do I square a number? So I have 16 raised to the second power. How would you write that in expanded form? 16 times 16. And when we times 16 times 16, it should give us our standard form number, which is 256. And if you go back and look at the chart we just completed, it's going to tell you 16 squared, or the square root of 256 would be 16, or 16 squared would be 256. How do I square root a number? For example, you have the square root of 100. You got to figure out what number you can multiply by itself to get the number under the radical. So self, what number times itself would give me 100? And if you say 10, you're correct. Let's look at example number 2. Now notice the difference. Example 1 was our principal square root, and example 2, now we have a negative in front of our radical. We have a non-negative and we have a negative square root. So we're going to figure out what number you can multiply by itself to get the number under the radical. So self, what number times itself will give me 196. And you notice where the radical is, so you're going to square the number first. Okay, so what that number is, 14, and all you have to do now is put the negative in front of the answer. Okay, hope that's making sense. Now I want you to try these by your lonesome and see if you can get it. Alright, what did you get for the first one? So did you ask yourself, what number times itself will give me 361? That number under the radical. And if you say 19 times 19, you're correct. So 19 times 19 will equal 361. So the square root of 361 is 19. Alright, number 2, what did you put? Okay, self, what number times itself will give me 225. 15 times 15 will give me 225. So what is the square root of 225? It's 15, and you have to bring down that negative. Hope that's making sense. Okay, how do we work with cubes and cube roots? So now we are going to learn the first 10 perfect cubes. So 1 cube, 1, okay, so I want you to fill those in. 8, 27, 64, 125, 216, 343, 512, 729, and 1000. Okay, so how do I cube a number? I have 8 to the third power. So you gotta remember, 8 is my base, 3 is my exponent. Remember, the little guy tells the big guy how many times to multiply itself, yes? So how many 8s should I have? I should have 8 times 8 times 8. And if you look above at your chart, you should write it in standard form as 512. Okay, how do I cube root a number? For example, number 1, the cube root of 729. So you're going to figure out what number can multiply by itself 3 times to get the number under the radical. So self, what times itself 3 times will give me 729. And if you say 9, you're correct. Now example 2. Now if you notice the difference with my square root and my cube root, it is okay to have a negative under the radical for a cube root, but it's not okay to have a negative under the radical for a square root. We are going to explore a little bit more when we meet and have our class discussion. But for now, let's go ahead and find the cube root of negative 216. So you're going to figure out what number you can multiply by itself to get the number under the radical. And then you're going to put the negative in front of your answer. So self, what number times itself 3 times will give me 216. And if you say 6, you're correct. And you bring your negative down, that will be negative 6. Hope that's making sense. Alright, so now I want you to try by your lonesome. Tell me what you got. Okay, let's see. 7 times 7 is equal to 343. So the cube root of 343, it's 7. Okay, let's look at number 2. I hope you're asking yourself, what number times itself 3 times will give me 64? If you say 4, you're correct. So we just go into what is the cube root of 64. So remember, you're going to write that 4 and bring your negative down. So the cube root of negative 64 is negative 4. Hope that's making sense.